What's going on, everyone? It's Adrian from Draft Time, and we're back with another picks video. Now, in this video, I'm going to go over tonight's five-game slate for FanDuel. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So first of all, some key questionable guys you want to keep an eye out for. You got Isaiah Hartenstein for the Knicks. So pay attention to see if he ends up missing the game. If he does end up missing the game, then obviously someone like Precious Achiuwa is going to be a lot more valuable. And then you got Andrew Nemhard for the Pacers, who are already without Tyrese Halliburton. So if Nembhard ends up missing the game, then pretty much everyone's going to be all over TJ McConnell. And they're probably already going to be all over TJ McConnell with no Halliburton. Now, as far as some key guys who are out, I just mentioned Halliburton. He's out. It's looking like he's going to miss the next few games. And then you got no LeBron for the Lakers. So, as far as the top value picks for the slate, the top value guy, that's going to be Zion Williamson. Now, he's only 7,700. He's playing at home against the Jazz, who actually allow the fourth most fantasy points to opposing power forward. So $7,700 is a really good price for Zion. And then you got Chet Holmgren at $7,800. That's a good price for Chet Holmgren. He's going against the Blazers, who are awful against opposing centers. They allow the third most fantasy points to opposing centers. So this is a really good matchup for him, and it's a pretty good price for Chet Holmgren, who hasn't been playing too well recently over his last five games. He's averaging just 32.7, but this is a good opportunity for him to bounce back tonight. And then you got Shea Gilgis Alexander, $10,900. That's a really good price for him going up against Portland, who allowed the sixth most fantasy points to opposing point guards. So that's a good matchup for him. Now, one thing though, you do got to be careful of with these OKC guys is the blowout potential. But we'll get into that later on. Then you got James Harden and Kawhi Leonard from the Clippers. They're both in the 8,000s, which is pretty good prices for both of them. They're actually going against the Lakers, who allow the fifth most fantasy points to opposing guards and the sixth most fantasy points to opposing forwards. So that's a pretty good matchup for them, and those are pretty good prices for those guys. And then you got a bunch of Lakers players with no LeBron James. You know, Austin Reeves, Rui Hachimura, D'Angelo Russell. Now you want to pay attention to who ends up getting that fifth start for the Lakers um, with LeBron out. So that's all my value picks. Now, before I go ahead and get into the games, I want to show you my top sleeper play for the night, and that's going to be now. This is going to be hit or miss. Okay, Tumani Kamara for the Blazers. Now, the thought process behind him being my sleeper pick is 4,400. That's a pretty Now, the thought process behind him being my sleeper pick is if this game is a blowout, like it's supposed to be, Portland at Oklahoma City, then you can expect Kamara to play a decent amount of minutes in the fourth quarter. And if he gives you 25, then he could end up breaking the slate at $4,400. And even though he's on a bad stretch, he's still playing in the 20s as far as his minutes. So he has a decent floor as far as his minutes go. You know, he's probably going to give you 20 minutes, even if the game's not a blowout. But I do anticipate the game being a blowout. And I think this is an angle that might end up paying off. But I'm not going crazy with this. I might do it in one or two lineups because there's some huge downside risk, obviously, taking Kamara. But yeah, he's my sleeper pick for the night. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first game. You got Denver at Indiana. Now, this game actually has the highest over under of the night. You got Denver, they allow the sixth fewest points per game. So they have a pretty good defense and they play at the slowest pace in the NBA. But something's got to give because then you got the Pacers. They play at the fastest pace and they allow the second most points per game. So you got Joker, who's coming off a monster game, 80 points against the Wizards. That was a really good matchup for him. The Wizards have an awful defense, and now the Pacers is another team that has an awful defense. And these matchups do matter. I mean, you had the Joker; he scored 80 against the Wizards, a bad defense. Last night, you had Embiid score over 100 against the Spurs, who are an awful defense. So I wouldn't be surprised if Joker has a monster game tonight. So I'm going to lock him into a bunch of lineups. Now you got Jamal Murray at $8,400. That's kind of expensive, but I'm still going to pick him up in a few lineups just because this is such a good matchup going against the Pacers. And one angle I'm going to take is I'm going to fade Harden in a few lineups for Jamal Murray. Harden's just $200 cheaper, and if Jamal Murray ends up having a big game against the Pacers with this good matchup and outscores Harden, that could be a really big differentiator. But besides that, I'm not going to go crazy with Jamal Murray. And then you got Aaron Gordon, Michael Porter. Of those guys, I think Aaron Gordon's the better pickup because he's $300 cheaper. So I like Aaron Gordon, especially this matchup. Um, So I'm going to do a few lineups with him. I might do one lineup with Michael Porter Jr., but I definitely think Aaron Gordon's the better play. And then Contavious Caldwell Pope at $5,100. I might throw him into one or two lineups just because of this matchup, but I think 5,100, he's priced right at that price. But then I don't really think anyone else is worth picking up. I think everyone else is too expensive. Now, one angle you might want to consider is fading Kawhi Leonard, who ends up getting picked up by the optimizer, and he might be pretty heavily owned. Kawhi Leonard, that is. So fading Kawhi Leonard for Pascal Siakam might be a decent angle to take tonight, just because there's no Halliburton, and Siakam is probably going to be their primary scorer. So I'm going to pick up Siakam in a couple items. Other than that, I'm not going to go too crazy because this is not a good matchup. And you got Miles Turner and Jalen Smith, and those guys seem to split minutes a lot. And I think $7,400 is too expensive for Miles Turner. So I don't think Miles Turner has that much of an upside. And you got Buddy Hield, who's actually on a pretty good stretch right now. He scored 30 plus in his last 3 games, but they raised his price to 6,300. So I think that's a little too expensive for Buddy Hield. Now TJ McConnell, on the other hand, everyone's going to be all over him with no Halliburton. And if Nembhard ends up missing the game, who's questionable, then people are really going to be all over TJ McConnell at $5,200. But he's almost too hard to pass up on. I mean, every time he ends up playing big minutes, he always has big games. So you almost have to take TJ McConnell. I mean, one angle for fading TJ McConnell that you might want to consider, this is the only angle I could think for fading him that is worth it, is fading him for Nembhard if Nembhard ends up playing the game. Other than that, I'm going to have a ton of TJ McConnell. Then you got Neesmith at $4,900. That's a decent price for him. He plays a decent amount of minutes, but he's just not very productive in the minutes that he plays. So I don't really think he has that high of an upside. Then you got Benedict Mathurin, who had a big game on the 18th against Sacramento, but then he followed that up with two awful games where he barely played any minutes. I mean, maybe you consider him in one lineup just in case because there's no Halliburton tonight, but I'm not going to go crazy with him. I think there's way too much risk there. And then Nemhard, like I mentioned earlier, maybe you consider fading uh, TJ McConnell for Nemhard in one lineup, but I'm not going crazy with him. And there's really no one else worth picking up for the Pacers. But let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. You got the Knicks at Brooklyn. Now, this is the game with the lowest over under of the night. You got the Knicks. They allow the third fewest points per game, and they play at the fourth slowest pace. And then you got Brooklyn, who's pretty average defensively, but they play at the ninth slowest pace. So expect this to be a pretty low scoring game. Now, for the Knicks, you got Hartenstein, who's questionable. So you want to pay attention and see if he ends up missing the game. I think that they're going to start Precious Achua if Hartenstein ends up missing the game. So everyone's going to be all over Achua. Now Brunson at $9,300. I think that's kind of expensive. He's coming off of two pretty good games in a row, 57 and 65. So that's why they raised his price. Um, I'm not crazy about him at this price, especially against this Brooklyn defense. I might throw him in one or two lineups just in case this hot streak continues. But other than that, I'm not going to go crazy with him. I think there's a lot more valuable guys at point guard tonight. Then you got Julius Randle at $9,000. It's a decent price for him, but Brooklyn is a bad matchup. Maybe you want to consider Julius Randle just in case the Knicks go with a small lineup at the end of the game and Randle is forced to be like a rebounder, which last game he finished with 16 rebounds where Hartenstein got hurt. So uh, maybe you throw him into one or two lineups taking that kind of angle, but I'm not going to go crazy with him with this matchup against the Nets in what should be a low scoring game. Then you got Hartenstein. If he plays, is he worth it? I don't think so. Then you got Hartenstein. If he plays, is he worth it at $7,200? I don't think so. This is a pretty bad matchup against Nick Claxton. Then you got OG Anunoby, who's been pretty consistent, but I don't think he has that high of a ceiling. So at $6,700, he hasn't given the Knicks 40 points since being traded to them. So I'm not going to go crazy with OG Anunoby. Then you got DiVincenzo at $5,700. That's pretty expensive. However, I might do one lineup with DiVincenzo and one lineup with Josh Hart if Isaiah Hartenstein ends up missing the game, because I could see a scenario where they go small at the end of the game and one of these guys ends up closing the game for the Knicks. And then no one else is worth it except Precious Achua if Hartenstein ends up missing the game, obviously. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Nets now. So you got Bridges. He's starting to find his groove again. He's averaging 39 and a half over his last 5 games. And at $7,700, he might be worth picking up in a few lineups. but I'm not going to do too much Mikal Bridges just because of that matchup against the Knicks. Then you got Nick Claxton at $7,500. I think he's too expensive. However, if Hartenstein ends up missing the game, I do see there being some upside with Nick Claxton, especially if the Knicks end up closing out the game with a really small lineup. Nick Claxton could end up being very productive against that smaller lineup. So I am going to lock in Nick Claxton into a few lineups. Spencer Dinwiddie at $6,300. He's had back-to-back 30-plus point games, but even a 30-plus game isn't going to get it done. He would have to give you, in the high 30s or low 40s in order to get it done. So I don't think he's going to do that against the Knicks. So I'm not going to go crazy with Dinwiddie. Then you got Cam Thomas at 6,200. I think the same applies to him. He's going to have to give you in the high 30s or low 40s, and I think that's going to be very difficult against the Knicks. But every now and then, Cam Thomas does pop off. So maybe you throw him into one lineup just in case. But like I said, I'm not going to go crazy with him with this matchup. And you got Cam Johnson at $5,800. I think that's a pretty good price for him. He's averaging 25 on the season. But like I've been saying, this is a bad matchup against the Knicks. So maybe throw him in one or two lineups. At $5,800, he'll probably have to give you like in the mid 30s, which he's capable of doing. So maybe you throw him in one lineup or two lineups just in case. But like I said, I'm not going crazy with any of these Nets players. Then you got Dorian Finney-Smith at $4,500. He plays decent minutes, Finney-Smith does, but he just isn't very efficient from a fantasy perspective in those minutes that he plays. So I don't think he has a high enough upside to make him worth picking up. And then Dennis Smith is way too expensive. Royce O'Neal too expensive. I'm not going to pick up any of these other guys. But let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. You got Utah at New Orleans. Now, this is actually the game with the second highest over under of the evening. You got Utah, they allow the eighth most points per game, and they play at the sixth fastest pace. And then you got New Orleans, they allow the 11th most points per game, and they play at the 12th fastest pace. Now, for Utah, you got Lauri Markkanen, who was on a nice stretch until last game against Houston. But besides that, he was on a pretty decent stretch. At $8,900, maybe you throw him in one lineup just in case he drops 50 again tonight, which he's capable of. But I think there's way better value picks at that power forward or a small forward spot tonight. So I'm not going crazy with marketing. And then you got Colin Sexton, who's $7,800. They raised his price because he's on a pretty good stretch. He's had three 40-plus point games in a row. So he's on a nice little stretch, which is why he's $7,800. But honestly, out of him and Jordan Clarkson, I'd rather have Clarkson, who's $800 cheaper, and he's coming off a 50-point game against Houston. So I'm not going to go crazy with either of these guys, but if I am going to pick one of them, I'm going to pick Clarkson. But then all these other guys, their value is absolutely horrible tonight, so I'm not picking up anyone else from Utah. Now let's go ahead and take a look at New Orleans. Now, like I mentioned earlier, you got Zion, who's actually the top value play as of right now for the evening at $7,700. That's a really good price for him. Like I said earlier, he's going against Utah, who allow the fourth most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. So if you are going to fade Zion just because he's going to be pretty heavily owned tonight, the person I think that you should fade him for is actually Brandon Ingram because these two are negatively correlated. So if Zion has a bad game, chances are Brandon Ingram could be having a good game. So I might try that angle in a few lineups. Other than that, I think Zion's a really good value. Then you got CJ McCollum at $7,900. I think that price is about right for him. Maybe you throw him in one or two lineups because he has a pretty good matchup tonight against Utah. But other than that, I'm not going to go crazy with him. Then you got Jonas Valanciunas at $7,100. I think that may be a little too expensive for him because he's not playing that much minutes. He's only playing, in the 20s as far as his minutes. So with those low minutes, I don't think he has that high of an upside. So I'm not going to pick up any Valanciunas. Then you got Herbert Jones at $4,900. They lowered his price because he's coming off of three sub 20 games. So he actually ends up getting picked up by the optimizers. So I think that's a good pickup. Maybe you consider fading him in a few lineups, but I'm going to have a decent amount of Herbert Jones. Then you got Trey Murphy, $5,300. I think that's too expensive for him. Larry Nance, $4,800. He just doesn't play enough minutes to justify picking him up. And then no one else really worth picking up. Everyone else is too expensive. But let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. You got Portland at Oklahoma City. Now, Oklahoma City is actually a 13.5 point favorite for this game. So this game has blowout written all over it. You got Portland. They allow the 12th most points per game, and they play at the 13th fastest pace. And then you got Oklahoma City, who's average defensively, and they play at the 10th fastest pace. For Portland, I'm really not crazy about any of these guys just because of the blowout potential. I mentioned Kamara being a potential sleeper pick earlier on. As far as Anthony Simons at $7,400, I mean, maybe you consider one of each of these guys. Maybe you consider one Anthony, one Jeremy Grant, one Malcolm Brogdon, just because they're all in the 7,000s and they could, easily give you in the high 40s. But other than that, I'm not going crazy with these guys, especially since they could easily be on the bench in the fourth quarter. Now for Oklahoma City, you got Shea Gilgis Alexander at $10,900. That's a really good price for him. That's why he's one of the top value picks, like I was talking about earlier. So I'm going to have him in a few lineups, but I'm not going to go too crazy with him because of the blowout risk. Um, and the same goes to Chet Holmgren. Chet Holmgren actually ends up getting picked up by the optimizer at $7,800. That's a really good price for him. So I may consider fading him actually in a few lineups. And one fade I might consider is fading him for Nick Claxton, who was someone I talked about earlier, who might be going up against a small Knicks team if Hartenstein ends up missing the game. Then you got Jalen Williams, who's been balling lately. He's averaging 39.4 over his last 5 games. He's got a good matchup, obviously, against this Blazers team. So I might put him in a few. But other than that, I'm not going to go crazy with him, especially with the blowout risk. Josh Giddey at $6,500. I'm not crazy about him. He doesn't play that many minutes. And I think he just doesn't have that high of an upside. And with the blowout risk tonight, I mean, he could end up, playing a little bit of the third quarter, and then that's it for the whole second half. So I'm not crazy about Josh Giddey. And then you got Dort at $5,000. He actually ends up getting picked up by the optimizer. Um, he might be someone that you might want to consider fading just because he doesn't have that high of an upside. Um, he's only had one 30-point game in his last 10 games, but it is a good matchup. $5,000 is a decent price for him. So I am going to have a lot of Dort. And then no one else really worth picking up on the Thunder. But let's go ahead and take a look at the last game of the evening. You got the Lakers at the Clippers. Now, for the Lakers, you got no LeBron James, which I mentioned earlier. The Lakers are average defensively, and they play at the eighth fastest pace. And then you got the Clippers. They allow the ninth fewest points per game, and they play at the fifth slowest pace. So not exactly a good matchup for the Lakers, but pretty good value on the Lakers considering there's no LeBron, even with that bad matchup. Now, the optimizer ends up picking up D'Lo, Austin Reeves, and Rui Hachimura for the Lakers. It doesn't pick up Anthony Davis. So I might consider locking in Anthony Davis, but capping off the Lakers players at 3 players. I don't want to pick up 4 Lakers against this Clippers defense. So I might consider doing that just because there's no LeBron. So AD has pretty decent value, but it's not a great matchup for AD going against this Clippers team. So that's the reason why I'm not crazy about AD. But they have the Clippers have no Zubac, so maybe they go with a small lineup to close out the game. And if they do that, then Anthony Davis could end up having a pretty big game. So I am going to lock him into a few. D'Angelo Russell at $7,100 with no LeBron James. He plays really well without LeBron. He actually had a really good game last night, or actually the night before. He finished with 53 points, and that was with LeBron. So really good value for D'Angelo Russell. Maybe I fade him in a couple of lineups because he ends up like in 100% of my lineups if I run like the top 10 lineups. And then Austin Reeves, another guy who's pretty valuable at $6,100. They lowered his price, and now with no LeBron James, he's going to get a lot more usage. So he's another guy who's going to be in a ton of my lineups, and I might fade him in a few, but I'm not going to fade him in that many. Then you got Rui Hachimura, $4,500. That's a really good price for him. He's been playing in the 20s as far as his minutes. He's probably going to get the start though tonight, so he should play a lot more minutes. So he's pretty valuable. Now, if you are going to consider fading Hachimura, maybe you fade him for Torian Prince, who is $100 cheaper. That's an angle I might take. Christian Wood, you might want to pay attention to see if he ends up getting the start for LeBron James. And if he does, he becomes a lot more valuable because he's very productive in low minutes. So if he does end up getting the start, then I'm going to have a lot of Christian Wood. And he's definitely going to be very heavily owned if he starts for LeBron. And then you got Jared Vanderbilt, who he's playing kind of like in the high teens, low 20s as far as his minutes. So maybe you consider doing some Hachimura fades for Jared Vanderbilt in a couple lineups. Other than that, though, I'm not going to go crazy with him. And then maybe you could even do the same with Cam Reddish, who he played 21 minutes last game. So for the most part, I'm going to go with a lot of lineups with these 3 guys, but I'm going to consider fading them in a few for some of these other guys who are going to be less owned. But yeah, that's the Lakers. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the Clippers. Now, for the Clippers, like I mentioned earlier, you got Kawhi Leonard and James Harden, who are extremely valuable. This is a pretty good matchup for them, and their prices being in the 8,000s is a pretty good price for them. Kawhi Leonard, I mean, he's averaging 42 on the season, So $8,600 is a very, very good price for him. And then James Harden at $8,200, that's a good price for him. Now, one of the angles I talked about earlier is possibly fading Kawhi Leonard for Siakam, um, who's playing without Halliburton tonight. Uh, Maybe you consider fading Harden for Jamal Murray against the Pacers. So that's a really good matchup for Jamal Murray. But other than that, I'm going to have a lot of lines with these two guys. Another angle is possibly fading Kawhi Leonard for Paul George. That's an angle I might take. Paul George is $300 cheaper, and he could easily outscore Kawhi Leonard. So yeah, those are some possible angles there. Then you got Russell Westbrook, who's coming off a pretty good game, finished with 46.8. I think he's too expensive, but maybe you consider him in one or two lineups just in case he repeats a performance like that, and the Clippers end up going with a small lineup to close out the game, and he ends up getting a lot of rebounds, which is definitely a possibility. Now, Mason Plumlee at $5,300, it's decent value, but he only played 18 minutes or 15 minutes actually last game. So I think there's a lot of risk there. So I might put him in one lineup just in case he has another 30 plus point game, which he did on the 16th against Oklahoma City. But besides that, I'm not going to go crazy with Mason Plumlee. And then everyone else on the Clippers, I think, is too expensive. But yeah, that's pretty much it for all the games. Now let's go ahead and run one lineup and just to see what we're working with. And you got D'Angelo Russell, James Harden, Herbert Jones, Austin Reeves. You got Dort, Kawhi Leonard. You got Zion, Rui Hachimura, and then Chet Holmgren. So yeah, that's the lineup. It's probably going to change before the game starts tonight. So make sure you sign up to drafttime.com and sign up for a free 7-day trial. That way you can update your lineup before the game starts tonight. But good luck to everyone tonight.